So let's begin our discussion of the respiratory system with a short discussion of its functions. So the primary function of the respiratory system is to allow these air passageways to get gases into the alveoli, which are these sacs surrounded by simple squamous epithelium so that you can do gas exchange, oxygen into the blood and CO2 out of the blood, but not all CO2. There's a common misconception that carbon dioxide is strictly a waste product, and that's not true, as you'll see later. We also use the respiratory anatomy for odor detection, that is, that there are olfactory receptors in the upper part of the superior part of the nose, and being able to smell different smells is important in protection. So one really good example is that being able to smell that food has started to rot or has gone rancid is a way to keep yourself safe from food poisoning. And one thing that you'll see in the elderly is that the olfactory receptors start to become less and less sensitive, and this is true of taste receptors as well, as we get older. A place where you can see this defense in real life is, imagine the last time that you walked into some place that's unfamiliar or someone else's home. Immediately you can smell things that are different. Like, think if they cooked fish the night before, you can smell it, but they probably can't smell it. Those olfactory receptors adapt pretty quickly. So once you know that a smell probably isn't dangerous to you, then you start to actually ignore it. Your brain starts to ignore it. Now up here in the frontal bone, in the maxillary bone, there's also some back here in the mastoid process of the temporal bone, are sinuses, and those sinuses are mucous membrane lined places that help you resonate sound. So they help to create an echo so that you can project your voice. The larynx is where the vocal cords are. So as air goes over the vocal cords and you stretch muscles and the ligaments in there, that's how you make sound. So this is the pathway of air through the respiratory organs. It goes through the nostrils to the nasal cavity. We'll talk about functions of that. And then here through the pharynx. And there are three parts of the pharynx. There's the nasopharynx, which is posterior to the nasal cavity, the oropharynx, posterior to the mouth or the oral cavity, and then the laryngopharynx. So this area of the laryngopharynx and the larynx is what I call the danger zone. So keep that in mind as we talk, and we'll come back to that. Once air leaves the laryngopharynx, it goes through the larynx and the glottis into the trachea, which is the common term is the windpipe, and then to the bronchi. Now from the bronchi, it's going to go into these smaller and smaller branches called bronchioles, and then ultimately will end up in these microscopic sacs called alveoli. So if you harken back to A&P1 and tissues, you'll remember that all of these passages of the body or cavities of the body that have exposure to the external environment in some way are lined with mucous membranes. The mucous membrane here throughout the respiratory tract is one that's meant to protect us from exchanging and inhaling pathogens or gases, so gag reflexes, sneezing reflexes, coughing reflexes, help us to keep those products out of the deeper parts of the body. Now this is a picture of the mucous membrane that lines most of the respiratory tract. This layer here, which is the one that lines the lumen or the opening of the nose, parts of the pharynx, the larynx, and the trachea and then down through some of the smaller bronchi is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia. The cilia here they have a wave-like motion, so they help to move mucus that hopefully has trapped any pathogens or debris and sweep it up and then out of the respiratory tract. So in some cases, you might sneeze this out, you might blow your nose. In most cases, without us knowing it, it actually ends up swallowed into the stomach, where stomach acid will degrade any of those pathogens, we hope. Goblet cells, which are these big, they look like fluffy white bubbles. There's several, one here, here, and here. Those secrete a protein called mucin. They have this protein called mucin. And when mucin is combined with water, it makes mucus. So you can think of mucus as sort of like a jello, and mucin as the powder that you add water to make the jello. So let's dive a little deeper into the functions of the different parts of the anatomy through the respiratory system. So it is normal for you to breathe through the nares or nostril, that's the external nares or nostril, and then air is going to come into here, into the nasal cavity, which has multiple functions. One is simply that it's a passageway for air to move from the outside to the inside of the body. It's lined by mucous membrane, so that should be a moist environment. So this part also warms the air, it humidifies the air, it helps to trap debris that might be in the air, chemicals that come into this area. You see up here where the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone is, the olfactory nerve, the nerve, cranial nerve number 1, that will gather smell information actually sits right here. Now these bony prominences are called nasal concha. The concha are literally pieces of bone that stick into the nasal cavity. So that gives you extra surface area, as do the meatuses, for mucous membrane to do all the jobs that we just talked about. Once air has gone through the nasal cavity, now it's going to go into the pharynx, and you should know the 3 separate parts of the pharynx. So air moves into the nasopharynx, then the oropharynx, and then just a little bit into the laryngopharynx. Another thing that you should notice here is that these areas here and here and here are tonsils. Now those tonsils are there to catch debris or catch pathogens. Say if you inhale a bacterium that someone else has sneezed out, or a virus that someone else has sneezed out, the hope is that those tonsils will catch that before it ends up in the respiratory passages and then ultimately in your blood or in your body tissues. Here I should also point out some tissue changes. So where we had pseudostratified ciliated columnar in the nasal cavity and the nasopharynx, when we get here to the oro and laryngopharynx, we change to a stratified squamous, because this area is shared by both food, which can be abrasive, or liquids that can maybe be really hot or really cold and you need some more protection there. And it's also what I call a danger zone. So I'm going to show you a video about why this is a danger zone, meaning think about why is it unsafe to talk and eat at the same time. We all know that it's not necessarily polite, but it's also dangerous.
Swallow. A food bolus is voluntarily pressed by the tongue up against the roof of the mouth and backwards towards the pharynx. In response to activation of pharyngeal pressure receptors, the swallowing center in the medulla initiates reflexes that prevent food entry into respiratory passageways. The uvula contracts, which blocks the nasal passages from the pharynx. The laryngeal muscles contract, closing the glottis at the top of the trachea by tightly aligning the vocal folds. The epiglottis swings down upon the closed glottis. With all airways blocked off, respiration is temporarily inhibited. As the upper esophageal sphincter relaxes, pharyngeal contractions drive the bolus into the esophagus.
So if we consider the fact that in order for you to make sound, air has to go through this area to the glottis and the vocal folds, and the epiglottis, which is elastic cartilage, would remain open. And the opposite is true if you're swallowing food. So if you're doing both of those at the same time, then those reflexes, or the brain trying to initiate those reflexes, becomes kind of confused. Do I keep the epiglottis open so you can talk? Do I close it so you don't aspirate food into the respiratory tract? So not a good scene altogether. So now we'll turn to the larynx itself, which is this area posterior to the thyroid cartilage. That's also known as the Adam's apple in a non-technical sense. It's also protected by the cricoid cartilage, which is inferior to the thyroid cartilage. And the thyroid gland is actually up here above the thyroid cartilage. But if you look at the thyroid cartilage from the side, and you can see the gland here, the idea is that the thyroid cartilage sticks out a little more. So if there was a glancing blow here, the hope is that the blow will move off the thyroid cartilage and away from the thyroid gland, so that we don't have an overabundance or underabundance of thyroid hormone, which is responsible for most of the regulation of metabolic processes in cells. So the larynx itself has several functions. It helps to keep the airway patent, which means open, so that it's always open. It's also responsible, as you just saw, for, with the epiglottis, helping to route food and air where they should go. Because it houses the vocal cords in the glottis, it helps us make sound. And when the epiglottis closes over it, we are doing what's called Valsalva's maneuver. And the easiest way to explain this is if you bear down as though you're trying to have a bowel movement, you increase the intra-abdominal pressure, which is pressure within the abdomen or the abdominal cavity. And that is meant to help force fecal material down through the colon and then out through the rectum and the anus. Sound production for us is a pretty important function. It's a pretty important part of being human. Not that you can't be human without making sound production, but the pitch of sound may indicate danger or excitement. The loudness of the sound may do the same kind of thing. And the way that we actually make sound in speech is dependent on a symphony of movements between muscles that are around the vocal folds, as well as the muscles in the tongue. Those are the hypoglossal muscles, the muscles of the lips, the orbicularis oris, some of the labial muscles as well.